agree this has been an incredibly inspiring afternoon, and an opportunity for us to learn about what's happened in the past, think a bit about where we are in our present, and perhaps most importantly, start planning ahead for what happens in the future. And so this is an opportunity for us to come together as a community and start having conversations about what that future should look like and where we need to go. In a minute, I'm going to ask each of the panelists, if they would, to weigh in on what they think are the major take-homes from today. But I'd like to start with my impressions. I'm seeing my major take-homes in basically three buckets. A bucket that focuses on the individual, a bucket that focuses on our professional networks, and a third bucket that focuses on our institutions. At the individual level, our first group of panelists talked about the importance of being tenacious. And certainly during their time, there was no way to make it without being tenacious. And later on, we heard Gilda use the term combative persistence. And that's what gets a lot of us through and continues to get us through. We also heard about the need for a strong sense of self. And in our last session, Joan Reed talked about the importance of social and organizational competencies and the need for the individual to develop those competencies, something that I think spills over into the institutional realm as well, because we need our institutions to provide the mechanisms for that to happen. We also heard about the need to inoculate individuals against stereotype threat in science, and certainly we still face that, despite all the hard work that our elders did many, many years ago. When it comes to professional networks, we heard about the need for role models, for coaches, and that those role models need to be available both in terms of the science, but also in terms of the leadership and as we aspire to leadership positions. We heard about the need for coaches and mentors and networks, potentially at the regional, the local, even the national level, that will help our young folk to aspire and to find the network of support they need as they move through and into leadership positions. Rita Caldwell used the term build a posse. She talked about and we've just heard in the last session, the importance of having people you can debrief with, the folks you can be real with and authentic with, and basically ask, was that a thing that makes you go, what just happened there? We also talked about the largely untapped potential of our professional societies as potential agents of change, and the need to engage with them more and to not only empower them, but ultimately hold them accountable for making that change happen. And then at the very end of our discussion in the last session, there was a question asked, how do we connect the people who need to be part of these networks and want to be part of these networks? And that may be a big piece of discussion that we want to have during these last few minutes. Finally, at the institutional level, I think perhaps the most important message we heard today, from my point of view, is that we really need to move past the deficit model. We should not be in the business of quote unquote fixing individuals. We should be looking at our toxic environments and basically prompting folks who are leading those toxic environments to take a second look and to do a little better. I think David Asai challenged us to inspire people to move beyond just being collectors or even nightlights and ultimately to become allies. How do we do that? Very challenging. And as David pointed out, many times as scientists, we don't have the frame of reference to do that. Scientists don't like to talk about race. They don't like to talk about feelings. They don't like to talk about emotions. And so we need to create those safe spaces where they can feel vulnerable and humble and have those important conversations. We heard a lot about the need for accountability. I think almost every one of our panelists mentioned that. And they talked about accountability as being important at every level of an organization, whether it's the CEO all the way down to the undergraduate student in the lab. And so we have to find ways to hold folks accountable and to make it clear that with that accountability comes the value add that comes along with having a diverse team of folks who feel empowered, who feel like their efforts are being recognized, who feel as though they can change the world. Finally, we heard about the importance of partnerships, not just within our institutions, but also between institutions, and not just academic institutions. Vernon talked about the importance of pulling in our folks from the private sector, foundations, other agencies, NSF, corporations. And let's not forget in those partnerships, the important role that some of our colleges and schools play, in particular our HBCUs and women's colleges. How do we empower and value those institutions in a way that they can realize their full potential and make the huge differences that we know that they are capable of making? So those were my major take homes from the day. And now I would love to open it up to any of our panelists who'd like to weigh in, maybe just for a couple of minutes before we go to questions, to tell us what you thought were the major take homes from our discussion today. I'll just throw the floor open.
I'll jump. I think you did excellent, as usual. I've been on CIAS with you long enough to know that you're going to do an excellent job. But really love what you did there in breaking it down. And I had accountability, diversifying the support structures and ideologies, as well as having a policy change to follow and sustain the cultural change. We actually have to transform at least the academy and our frameworks for looking at what we value in the academy. And I think equity and inclusion has to become a value. And if it's a central value, then they're not special programs anymore. And it's not transactional that we do this thing. And it's not conditioned on the fact that we need this short-term gain, otherwise it's not worth it. It's what we do. And I think we're not there yet. I think we're still talking about learning about racism, which is frankly shocking to me. But if it's where we are, it's where we are. And I think we've got to commit to a broader portfolio of who we attract, recruit, and retain. I think there's still a lot of focus on this front end. In fact, Joan talked about this. Leadership can come from a lot of different places besides science. Mm-hmm. That's part of it. Let's be more creative about it. I think
but never mind.
You need to diversify and be more inclusive in leadership at the same time that you're bringing in junior folks, because that tells them, oh, you're serious. Instead of saying, come in and fix our problem, which is what it says if you're only bringing in people from the bottom level. So once again, I plus 100 everything that you just said, but maybe a few nuances there in terms of let's try to be innovative in this space in the same way that we're trying to be innovative in all the technical spaces, all the scientific spaces.
Really appreciate that framing, Vernon. And you just prompted me to remember something that John Slaughter said. I loved his statement, quality and equality are not mutually exclusive. I think that needs to become our mantra.
Absolutely. Yeah, Suzanne, I had actually sent you a chat saying that what an amazing job you had done with the synthesis. Vernon, I would just really second and say how much I appreciate your comment about this notion of even broadening our lens to think about what types of skill sets we really need in our field. And as I said, I think that this very narrow aperture that we keep is a smokescreen, which has enabled a lot of institutions to throw up these roadblocks and barriers. And so again, I just thank you for reinforcing that. I think it's a really important point. But Suzanne, you did a great job. I really have nothing else to add.
So I want to again applaud you for capturing so nicely so much of the discussion. I want to. There's two points I want to make, and one is around this idea of our institutions embracing issues around equity, et cetera. And if you go back to Sullivan Commission, some other kinds of things, embedding it within the mission statement of the organizations, it's words. And then how does it become part of the values? So if I think about where I am at Harvard Medical School, one institution, this diversity and inclusion are in the mission statement. Diversity is in the values, but also promoting equity and social justice. So it spells it out so that when you're doing this work, you're doing work for the mission of the organization. But then how does that get translated? And I think about some of the institutional and dean's level awards that are around diversity, around equity and social justice, and the mentoring, the kind of things we talk about. And we've just changed part of the promotion policy. So work in this space counts towards promotion. So how do you move from including it in words to actually changing how people are valued and judged, and the work that they do is valued and judged? And so for us now, it's how do you move that forward? So we've gotten part of the policies changed. How do we prepare individuals to make use of that? How do we prepare, train, educate the gatekeepers about these changes. And then within this space, I just want to underscore this importance of data and evidence that all too often the work we do in the space is very limited, and we're looking at the picture on the wall versus understanding the changes that are happening internally. And so how do you build how do you identify the data and build the evidence and track and hold people accountable over time? And for me, in an academic institution, for those in science, data and evidence are critically important. And when we are looking at this lens of diversity, at equity, et cetera, we should have the same expectations that we have in the other work that we do.
Hear, hear.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things, if I can get a second chance, David, I want to make sure you have an opportunity, so I don't want to do too much talking. But, you know, I think that another point is that we really have to move all of these initiatives out of the sense that these are remedial somehow. And I think even as important as the social justice lens is, I think that the strategic imperative, the value of this is another really important message that we have to deliver. That, especially for the science professions, which are, you know, data driven, as you said, Joan, the move towards innovation. Diversity is front and center. It's embedded in what's needed to do this work effectively. And I think we also need to have that spin on our message. This is not a nice to have. This is something that's really critical. It should be critical to the mission of our fields.
David, did you want to add?
Well, yeah, I can't say it better than what everybody has already said, but I just wanted to emphasize something that has already been said, which is that when we talk about things like value and culture, environment, when we talk about these things, we have to be specific. And so to be specific, at least for me, I have to reflect on what I really mean by that. So in science, you know, we should ask ourselves, so what do we really value? Not what do we say we value, but what do we really value? I think, and maybe I'll get into trouble for saying this, but I think that it is still largely, in science, it is still largely a value system which is based on selection and exclusion. I think that Joan mentioned this in a different way, I think, but we look at awards, and you know, we celebrate awards in which just one or two or three people receive an award, even though we know that a gazillion people contributed to that. And yet we elevate some, and we don't really celebrate the same kinds of collaborations, the same kinds of contributions that other people have certainly made. We talk about, you know, we may not talk about this, but we really believe in science, in pedigree. So we really care about, well, so where did this person go to school? With whom did he work with? You know, and as long as we continue to do that, we become an ingrown kind of an organ. Now I know that there are places that are not this way. I'm making some generalizations here, but this is, you know, I've been in science for a long time, and I believe that this is still some of our aspects. I'll just say one more thing, and that has to do with the language that we use. One of my hobbies, maybe hobbies would be too strong, but I go online and I read institutions' strategic plans. Especially when I'm preparing to go give a talk at some place, I'll go and look at their strategic plan. You should do the same thing, because almost every strategic plan talks about excellence, but very few of them define what they really mean by excellence. Almost every one of them, and excellence, by the way, if you look it up, is a comparative term. And so it is all about exclusion. It is all about, I'm number one. Well, if we all are excellent, then, you know, we can't all be number one, right? So we ought to be thinking about this stuff. When we talk about, when we use our language, so Joan mentioned this, that a mission statement is so important. And if we can't say it, if we can't say that we really believe in this stuff, we really want to do this, then it's a non-starter, right? And so we've got to be able to say these things. We've got to be able to define our terms. And And again, I come back to what I said earlier when we had our earlier session, which is that I think to engage in reflection and then learning and then holding ourselves accountable takes time. And it just takes time. It's individuals as well as the whole group taking the time to really think about this. So we should go back and we should ask ourselves, so what do we really value at my organization? Not what do we say but what do we really value, and how do you know that? What is the evidence that we value that? And I think that's a place to start. So long sermon. Thank you.
I think we're all singing the same song, but I also think we're preaching to the converted, to the choir, so to speak. So I wonder, a question came up in among the questions, and I think it's an important one, and that is, how do we incentivize? How do we incentivize those who aren't part of the choir yet to join the choir and sing along with us?
If I could step in, I would say that David has in many ways shown the way, because one of the things that we've learned, I think, over the years is that if you incense people with saying, if you do this, we will give you this money if you do this. It worked with Advance, at least to a certain extent. It's certainly working with some of the programs that have happened at Howard Hughes. Those have been transformational in allowing curricula and development to occur within institutions. And the thing that can happen, doesn't always, but can, is that once people start doing this, they say, oh, my goodness, look what I've been missing out on. This happened at MIT. I mean, when I was a graduate student there, I got put on the visiting committee shortly after I graduated, because you got to have an alum, and there I could go beat the diversity drum. So every year for my term, which was 6 years, I would go to these meetings, and my job was to raise my hand and say, how are we doing on diversity here with faculty and fellows and so forth? And my friends and mentors would say to me, well, we don't have to worry about that. The best come to us. We don't need to worry about that. Well, when there was the threat of losing a training grant, because there just wasn't enough documentation that the department in this case wasn't taking it seriously, then they scrambled to put in place a summer training program for minority individuals from across the country. And that same faculty were saying, oh my goodness, these are great students. I want more. And they've admitted them into now the graduate school. There's a reasonable representation there. And they have their first faculty member of color, who many years ago started as an undergraduate. So it's slow, but it can have an effect. And then that dominoes. So that's one way to help incentivize with a very straightforward positive enforcement. Someone in the question and answers has also said, well, what about mandating certain things? It is interesting that in Europe, the number of women on boards went up dramatically when that became required by law. Yeah. And although there were complaints initially, as there are in this country, over any possibility of that sort of thing, as several of you have pointed out, companies who have good diversity, at least gender diversity, do better at the bottom line. Yeah. There's also documentation of scientific effort. Papers with a more diverse author set tend to cluster at the more highly cited range. So, the data is out there. It's that most of us don't know it.
Lydia, I'd like to build on that point because you talked about mandates and incentives, but the importance, I think, of data is really critical, and not just process data. We have a lot of data. We count things, the numbers but data on impact. I think this goes in a way, David, to what you were saying. I mean, what are the metrics that matter to us and by which we really gauge what we define as success? And I think in the corporate world, this is getting a bit of traction, because there's a lot of data now that really shows that companies with more diverse teams and more diverse leadership do well on the bottom line metrics. I mean, academic institutions have performance metrics as well, by which they judge their success. So I think data can play a very important role in this, but not data that's counting, not process metrics, impact metrics that speak to what we know motivates the behavior of our different institutions.
Yeah, if I could jump in, I agree completely. And I think those are data that we don't have as extensively on the academic side. And then that's a place where I think our federal funding agencies could be of help to us if they provide us with resources to gather those data.
So one of as along those lines, one of the things that several years ago, NIH had these Pathfinder Awards and around advancing diversity, and I received one of those awards, and it was around data. And what we actually did was build this data set that has been maintained since then. It's got a research purpose, but it's also now a quality improvement purpose. And so we can measure what is going on within the organization. Part of it's process, but part of it is really about when you're just looking at those final numbers, you know, like, did we go up by 5 from this year versus 4 from last year? You actually don't know what's going on within the institution. And you don't know about the experiences of individuals within the institution, or where to target efforts. You don't know how to do these experiments to see, if I do this, how does it change? And so for me, in an academic institution, data trumps anecdote in any meeting that I attend. And so how do I build those data? And then we can question methodology. We can argue from there, but first let me have the data. The other part I'm going to say is this absolute importance of outcomes and understanding what outcomes matter. So another program we have, which is around faculty fellowships and moving into leadership positions. And of the fellows, I've had 50 fellows that have been trained, and we have 70% retention at Harvard. We now have 5, and soon will be 6 full professors out of that. We have 8, soon 9 associate professors out of that, department chairs out of that. And we're looking at all the other kind of metrics that the academic institution, like a Harvard, would look at. But we're looking at people moving into positions of leadership and change throughout the organization. And so looking at those outcomes, and one of the things in our academic settings, it's someone who's skeptical then saying, well, wait a minute, I want this, you know, that competition between departments and institutions. And that has served us well too. But if you're not tracking, if you don't have data, if you can't show the effectiveness of what you've done, then things fall by the wayside.
Another thing that's coming up in some of the questions in the chat and came up in our discussion was this sort of intersection between the social and behavioral sciences and the natural sciences that is perhaps not completely tapped. And that comes up in the context of how we engage. It comes up in the context of how we help people to feel comfortable having these conversations. Comes up in the context of how we look at and understand individuals. I wonder if you all might comment a little bit on where you see that intersection and whether you see that as another potential fruitful avenue as we move forward.
I think that's critical. As someone who, like David, had no exposure to any of these things as an undergraduate or a graduate student, except that the graduate advisor, Salvaluri, insisted we all read poetry with him once a week. And then like David, I've been on a learning journey and then I've taken that one step to maybe provide just the most basic stuff to some of my colleagues who tend to dismiss the social sciences out of hand. It's critical. And this is not just a problem in the sciences. It is a national problem. Nationally, we do not value the social sciences. And this is reflected if you look at the NSF or NIH. I mean, it took a long time for NIH to even have a program that dealt with the social sciences. And at NSF, SBE, the social, biological, and economic sciences, is the tiniest directorate there, and they've always had the least funding. There is some big funding coming, and maybe the budget ever gets passed, and hopefully that can have an impact there too. because it's clear that if we starve those sciences, then we do ourselves a disservice throughout our endeavors. That partnership is absolutely critical. And it was people like David and Cliff Poudry, who we'll hear from on another day, that insisted that that partnership had to be part of the evaluation of programs, that natural scientists did not have the skill set to do proper evaluations of much of anything. And so that partnership is really essential. And that, which was pretty much a mandate, worked. People started talking to each other, and there has been more of that kind of discussion and collaboration, but it's still pretty nascent.
Well, I'll just hold myself up as an example of someone whose degrees are in the social sciences. You know, I was a political sociology major in college, and my PhD is in health policy and management. So that, you know, I've approached this with, I've learned a lot of science over the course of my career, but I'm not a scientist, and I feel that I really use far more of my training in other areas in the work that I do. I know, and David, this goes to your point though about the club and being somewhat exclusive, but the fact that I have a PhD as opposed to a business degree, if you will, has been really important in my acceptance in the scientific world. But the fact is, I'm not a scientist, and it's why I hammer so hard on this issue that our field, at least when we are talking now about the commercialization, you know, of our discoveries, relies very heavily on people who are not scientists, and that we need to think of the field more broadly than just the science. But I'm a good example, and here I am, the chair of the Association for Women in Science.
Well, Susan, you are a scientist. You are a social scientist, and we need to.
Thank you, David, for the validation.
Earlier, right, we were talking about this need to measure and to assess our progress, and we've agreed that it's not just counting beans, but it's asking what is changing in terms of the culture, in terms of how people are feeling, in terms of inclusion. Well, I certainly don't have the expertise to do that, but there's no reason that I can't try to learn from social scientists who can measure that. And so I'll just mention a couple of things. You know, Lydia mentioned Cliff Poudry, our friend Cliff. You know, when Cliff was at the NIH, he created an R01 mechanism to actually marry the practitioners and the researchers in the social sciences. And so, right, we have social scientists who are working with the practitioners, the people who don't know the social science, but who want to create programs, right? A second example is what Tony DePass and others have done with understanding interventions, which is intentionally to bring practitioners, dummies like me, with social scientists who actually do the research, and to bring us together so we can learn from each other. And then I think the third thing just to mention is that it's my understanding that the National Academies will be launching a study that's exactly to do this. That is to bring social scientists together with practitioners to write a study together on you know, diverse, I don't know the title, but diversity and equity and inclusion. And so those are all very promising things. So I guess all I'm saying is that I would never pretend to know much of that stuff. But I don't have to necessarily know all that stuff, as long as I'm willing, and perhaps to show a little bit of humility, that I don't know this stuff. But there are people who know a hell of a lot more than me. Very few of us can combine in our careers what, for example, Joan has been able to do. I look up to Joan a lot because of your, I'm sorry, Joan, to call you out like this, but to have both sort of sets of expertise in one person, it's too rare, and you know, so I really appreciate it, but I also know that you're rare, and so you know.
So we've talked about social science, and another thing that's come up in the questions in the chat is the role that science education might potentially play as well. We haven't touched on education at all, but I wonder if there's a role for folks who are in that sphere and maybe working. I think a lot of what we talked about is directed at efforts that would happen at the higher ed level. Maybe these are the kinds of conversations and trainings and discussions that ought to be happening way back when folks are just forming their opinions and ideas about who belongs in science, who should be a leader in science, and the roles that folks should have.
I again, this is one institution. The SCP is very different. So I saw some of the questions in the chat about broader than one institution, and BSCP, which we're not spending time on, has students from over 38 states and over 250 institutions. So it crosses the country in terms of reach. But when you speak specifically about science education, I think there are things that each of us within our institutions can do, as our institutions can do, to support science education on the ground where we are. And yes, there's things you can do nationally, and from our offices, we've written curriculum that's gone to NASA and other places. But on the ground in Boston, parts of the students in Boston do part of their AP biology at Harvard Medical School. On the ground, we develop teacher professional development and training and pieces with the curriculum with the public schools, with the teachers and community organizations. We have after-school programs, summer programs, and other things, with a clear understanding that part of our commitment is to serve the community around us. And so how do we partner with that community to help ensure that those students have opportunities? For me, it's when I see the student that was in our high school program in a residency and then on faculty. It's being able to track that all the way through.
Anyone else want to weigh in on science ed?
Well, I speaking, as an African American, a Black person, as we all know, our communities have had tenuous relationships with science for a variety of reasons, and they're certainly known. And I think that science education could play a role in not just demystifying, but creating greater interest and a greater ability to overcome some of the concerns that certain communities have about the sciences, the natural sciences, and encouraging kids to really maybe take a look and being able to move past some of the mythology that continues to be very, very prevalent in our communities.
Science education is the driver for whatever we're going to be able to do in terms of changing things, because as we know, the population of young people now who are in the K through 12 system are already majority persons of color. And so, whether we like it or not, we've got to figure out how to include them in everything we do, including science education. I think in science education, actually all forms of teaching, we know this, that the most effective teaching is when I can tell a story, right? So if I tell a story and there's a lesson there, then that sticks better in my head than just reading some stuff. Well, so it's on us who are teaching, who are faculty members. It's on us, people who write textbooks. It's on us to tell the stories, find the stories, not of old dead white guys. I call them the founding fathers of I teach biology, so the founding fathers of biology, all white and almost all male. And why not talk about some of the incredibly exciting stuff that is happening by people who are with us today, who are coming from all different kinds of backgrounds, who have all different ethnicities, and there's so much going on right now that illustrate the same points that we do when we talk about the founding fathers. So we're smart enough to do this, right? We should be creative enough to design our teaching in that way. And so I think it's on us. And if we don't get it right, then I think we're going to fail because of the population of kids that are coming into our schools right now.
Yeah, I agree, David. And I think Rita Caldwell raised the intriguing concept of potentially reviving K-12 and using it as an opportunity to place graduate students in K-12 classrooms where they could be the role models, the coaches, the indicators that science is more diverse now than it was in the past. I know we're coming down to our last couple of minutes, but there's one other thing that's come up in the chat I thought we might end on. I've heard some people say never let a good pandemic go to waste. And so this question really refers to that and the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on Black and Brown communities. And so essentially, how do we take that horrible, horrible news and use it as a lever to drive home the need for the important approaches and new ways of thinking that we've discussed today?
One of the things I want to raise with this, because I think it's very much related in a different way, as we talk about that sort of fundamental basic science versus the social sciences or population science. And I think this pandemic is a very, very clear case, not just of the historical context for what we see today that Susan alluded to, but also to the fact that you can have the best science, the amazing science that brought forth these vaccines. But unless you have that social science and that population science and that work with community and other things, you are still not going to be able to stem this negative tide. And so it's actually not just one discipline or one approach, but it's actually bringing them together that creates the possibility for change. I would move it a little bit further. So it's not just this ability to marry this population health and these other kind of things together. I actually think that when we start to do our training of our scientists, they need to understand this perspective. They need to understand about implementation and about dissemination and about the impact, the potential impact that can occur when discoveries or technology have a different impact across different populations. It should be a part of their understanding, not just in the social science classroom, but in the basic science classroom at the same time. Yeah. Again, crossing discipline.
I agree. I would just say very quickly, for all of the downside of the pandemic, let's not lose sight of the fact that there was an incredible amount of diverse talent involved in getting these vaccines to market. Kismekia Corbett at NIH, Belen Carrillo Rivas, who was in charge of all the FDA application, all the data collection and quality at Pfizer. And I think we shouldn't lose and many more. And I think we just should not lose the opportunity to showcase who was really involved. What is the face of science that is behind the fact that we have had an incredible amount of innovation. So there's a downside, but I think there's an upside, and we shouldn't lose the opportunity to broadcast what's been an upside.
Well, I want to thank everybody on the panels today. This has been a wonderful, wonderful conversation. I know sometimes I find myself kind of in the doldrums, feeling like the world is very dark and that the chances of us moving into the light are getting slimmer and slimmer. But our conversation today gives me hope, and I hope it's given others hope as well. And I hope that we can leverage some of the approaches and ideas we've talked about today to move forward. At this point, I should turn, I think, back to Lydia to close us out, or to Jose.
Thank you so much. And thank you for attending. Those of you who have been with us through the whole day, it's remarkable.